What happens when Hollywood's most beloved late-night host meets the world's most controversial royal exile, and a simple interview spirals into television chaos that no one saw coming? Tonight, we're diving deep into the explosive confrontation that had security scrambling, producers panicking, and viewers watching in absolute shock as Meghan Markle was escorted off the Jimmy Kimmel live set after what started as a routine promotional appearance turned into a heated battle of words that exposed years of buried tensions. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think really happened behind the scenes, because what you're about to hear will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about celebrity interviews gone wrong. The evening began like any other taping at the historic El Capitan Entertainment Center. Jimmy Kimmel, fresh off his monologue about the latest political scandals, was settling into his desk chair as his production team made final adjustments to the lighting. The guest lineup seemed straightforward enough, a mix of comedy and celebrity, glamour that had become the show's signature formula. But as Meghan Markle walked onto the stage in a perfectly tailored navy blazer, her smile bright under the studio lights, no one in that audience could have predicted they were about to witness television history in the making. Jimmy started, with his typical warm welcome, the kind that had made him America's favorite late-night personality. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Meghan Markle," he announced, gesturing toward his guest with the practiced ease of someone who had conducted thousands of interviews. The audience applauded enthusiastically as Meghan settled into the guest chair, crossing her legs and maintaining that poised demeanor she had perfected during her royal years. "So, Meghan, it's great to have you here," Jimmy began, leaning back in his chair with a casual smile. "I have to ask, because everyone's curious, how has life been treating you since stepping back from royal duties? Are you enjoying the freedom?" Meghan's response came with a slight pause, her media training evident as she chose her words carefully. "Well, Jimmy, I think freedom is a relative term, isn't it? When you've been under the kind of scrutiny that Harry and I faced, everything feels different. But yes, we're building something beautiful in California, focusing on our family and our philanthropic work." Jimmy nodded, seeming satisfied with the diplomatic answer, but then he leaned forward, slightly his expression shifting to something more probing. "You know, there's been a lot of talk about your relationship with the British media, and frankly, with the American media too. Some people say you've been, well, let's call it selective about when you want privacy and when you want publicity. How do you respond to critics who say you can't have it both ways?" The question hung in the air for a moment longer than comfortable television timing would typically allow. Meghan's smile faltered almost imperceptibly, but those watching closely could see something shift in her posture. Her hands, which had been relaxed in her lap, tightened slightly as she processed what many would later describe as the first real challenge of the evening. "I think that's an unfair characterization, Jimmy," she replied, her voice maintaining its measured tone, but carrying a new edge. "Harry and I have been consistent about wanting privacy for our family while still being able to share our story and our work. That's not having it both ways. That's being human." Jimmy seemed to sense he had touched a nerve, and rather than backing away, he pressed forward with the kind of journalistic instinct that had served him well in more serious moments of his career. "But Meghan, you have to understand how it looks to people. You do a tell-all interview, you write books, you sign massive deals with streaming platforms, all while asking for privacy. Can you see how that might seem contradictory?" The studio audience, which had been warmly receptive just minutes earlier, seemed to collectively hold its breath. This wasn't the light-hearted banter they had expected from a late-night talk show. Meghan's media training was being put to the ultimate test, and the cameras captured every micro-expression as she formulated her response. "What I can see, Jimmy, is how the narrative gets twisted," she said, her voice rising slightly in both volume and intensity. "Every time Harry and I try to control our own story, we get accused of seeking attention. Every time we step back, We get accused of being ungrateful. It's a game we can never win, and frankly, I'm tired of playing it." Jimmy raised his eyebrows, clearly not expecting such a direct confrontation. The seasoned host had interviewed presidents, movie stars, and controversial figures without missing a beat. But something about Meghan's response seemed to catch him off guard. "I'm not trying to twist anything," he said, his tone becoming more defensive. "I'm asking questions that I think a lot of people have. Isn't that what interviews are for?" "Questions, yes," Meghan shot back, uncrossing her legs and leaning forward in her chair. "But loaded questions designed to make me look hypocritical? That's something else entirely. And I think your audience deserves better than that kind of tabloid journalism masquerading as entertainment." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Jimmy's expression shifted from mild surprise to something approaching irritation. His writers and producers, watching from the wings, began exchanging worried glances. This was rapidly moving beyond the boundaries of typical late-night television, venturing into territory that could make or break careers depending on how it was handled. "Tabloid journalism?" Jimmy repeated, his voice carrying a note of incredulity. "Meghan, I've been doing this show for over 15 years. I've interviewed everyone from Barack Obama to random people on the street, and I've never been accused of tabloid journalism. Maybe the problem isn't the questions. Maybe it's that you don't like being held accountable for your choices." The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence as those words hit their target. Meghan's composure, which had been carefully maintained throughout her public life, began to show visible cracks. Her breathing became more pronounced, her jaw tightened, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of diplomatic politeness. "Held accountable?" she said, her voice rising to a level that made the audio engineers frantically adjust their levels. "Jimmy, I've been held accountable for everything from the color of nail polish I wear to the way I hold a baby. I've been accountable for my father's behavior, for my husband's choices, for the British weather on the days I made public appearances. So don't sit there in your comfortable chair and tell me I need to be held more accountable." Jimmy's face flushed slightly, and for the first time in the interview, he seemed genuinely flustered. "Look, I'm not trying to attack you personally, but you came on this show to promote your work, right? Part of that means answering tough questions. That's how this works." "No, Jimmy, that's how it works for some people," Meghan replied, standing up from her chair in a move that caught everyone in the studio by surprise. "But apparently, for me, it works differently. For me, every question comes with 20 years of baggage and assumptions that I somehow deserve less respect than your other guests." The camera operators, trained to follow the action, kept their lenses focused on both host and guest as the situation continued to deteriorate. Jimmy remained seated, but his body language had shifted entirely, his relaxed posture replaced by the rigid stance of someone who realized they were losing control of their own show. Standing behind the guest chair now, Meghan's presence seemed to fill the entire studio space in a way that sitting had not allowed. The audience members in the front rows could see her hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from what appeared to be barely contained frustration that had been building for months, perhaps years, and was now finding its outlet on live television. Jimmy, still seated but clearly unsettled by this unexpected turn, tried to regain control of the interview with the kind of diplomatic deflection that had saved him in countless other situations. "Meghan, why don't you sit back down and we can talk about this like adults," he said, gesturing toward the empty chair with what he probably hoped looked like paternal concern. The suggestion seemed to ignite something even deeper in Meghan's already frayed composure. "Like adults?" she repeated, her voice carrying a bitter laugh that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Jimmy, I've been trying to have adult conversations about these issues for years, but every time I open my mouth, it gets twisted into clickbait headlines and social media controversy. So forgive me if I'm not interested in sitting down and pretending this is normal." The show's executive producer, watching from the control room, began making frantic hand gestures to his team. This was uncharted territory for a show that prided itself on maintaining a lighthearted atmosphere even during more serious interviews. The decision to cut to commercial was being seriously considered, but the raw authenticity of what was unfolding made everyone hesitate to interrupt what could become the most talked-about television moment of the year. Jimmy's media instincts kicked in, and he decided to lean into the confrontation rather than trying to diffuse it. "You know what, Meghan? Maybe that's because some of your conversations haven't been entirely honest. I mean, there have been inconsistencies in some of the things you've said publicly. People notice these things." "Inconsistencies?" Meghan's voice rose to a level that made the studio sound engineers wince through their headphones. "What you call inconsistencies, I call learning and growing and having the right to change my mind without having every word I've ever spoken dissected like evidence in a criminal trial. But apparently, that's a luxury I'm not allowed to have." The tension in the room had become almost palpable, with audience members looking around at each other with expressions that ranged from excitement to genuine concern. This wasn't the entertainment they had expected when they came to see a taping of Jimmy Kimmel live, but it was certainly more riveting than anything they had ever witnessed on television. Jimmy stood up from his desk now, perhaps feeling that remaining seated put him at a psychological disadvantage, or maybe just needing to match Meghan's energy level. "Look, I'm not trying to put you on trial here, but when you make public statements, they become part of the public record. When you contradict yourself, people are going to point it out. That's not persecution. That's just how public life works." "Public life?" Meghan stepped closer to Jimmy's desk, her voice dropping to a more dangerous register that somehow felt more threatening than her earlier outbursts. "Jimmy, you have no idea what public life is like for someone like me. You wake up every morning to positive press coverage and fan mail. You get to make jokes and people laugh with you, not at you. Your family doesn't get death threats because of things you said on television." The mention of death threats seemed to sober Jimmy slightly, and for a moment his expression softened with what might have been genuine concern. "I didn't know you were getting death threats," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier edge. "Of course you didn't know," Meghan replied, her tone shifting to something that sounded almost pitying. "Because that's not the story anyone wants to tell. The story everyone wants to tell is that I'm difficult, that I'm ungrateful, that I somehow brought all of this on myself. But the real story, the one about a woman who tried to serve her adopted country and got crucified for it, that's not interesting enough for your show, is it?" Jimmy's face reddened again, and his earlier attempt at empathy vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Don't turn this around on me and my show. You came here tonight, Meghan. You booked this appearance. If you didn't want to answer questions, you should have stayed home." "I came here because I thought you were different," Meghan shot back, her voice cracking slightly with what sounded like genuine disappointment. "I thought Jimmy Kimmel, the guy who cries about health care and stands up for immigrants, might actually understand what it's like to be treated unfairly by the media. But I guess I was wrong about that too." The personal nature of the attack seemed to hit Jimmy harder than anything else that had been said during the increasingly volatile exchange. His jaw clenched visibly, and when he responded, his voice carried a cold anger that his regular viewers had rarely, if ever, heard before. "You know what, Meghan? Maybe the media treats you the way they do because of moments exactly like this one. Maybe it's not about your race, or your nationality, or your royal status. Maybe it's because when things don't go exactly your way, you lash out and blame everyone else instead of looking in the mirror." The words seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence, and for several seconds, neither host nor guest spoke. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, realizing they were witnessing something that would be replayed and analyzed for weeks to come. Camera operators continued filming, but several of them later admitted they felt more like war correspondents than entertainment professionals. Meghan's response, when it finally came, was delivered in a voice so quiet that the microphones had to strain to pick it up. Yet every word carried the weight of accumulated years of frustration and hurt. You just proved my point better than I ever could have, Jimmy. A woman expresses frustration about being treated unfairly, and immediately she's accused of lashing out. A woman stands up for herself, and she's told to look in the mirror. Thank you for showing your audience exactly what I've been dealing with. Jimmy realized too late that he had walked directly into a trap of his own making, but his pride prevented him from backing down. This isn't about gender, Meghan, and you know it. This is about accountability, something you seem allergic to. Accountability. Meghan repeated the word like it tasted bitter in her mouth. You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about the accountability of a media that builds people up just to tear them down. Let's talk about the accountability of hosts who invite guests on their shows just to ambush them with gotcha questions. Let's talk about the accountability of an industry that profits from human misery and calls it entertainment. The studio had become so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning system was clearly audible through the sensitive recording equipment. Jimmy's writers, watching from the wings, had given up trying to slip him notes or suggestions. This had moved far beyond anything that could be scripted or controlled. Jimmy's next words would later be described by media analysts as either the most honest thing he had ever said on television or the biggest mistake of his career, depending on which side of the controversy they supported. You know what, Meghan? Maybe you're right about the media. Maybe we are all terrible people who profit from misery. But at least we're honest about what we do. We don't pretend to be humanitarian saints while cashing checks from streaming services and complaining about privacy in the same breath. The accusation seemed to be the final straw for Meghan, whose carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely. "How dare you?" she said, her voice rising to a level that made several audience members instinctively lean back in their seats. "How dare you question my humanitarian work, my commitment to causes I believe in, just because I also happen to need to make a living? You sit here in your glass house throwing stones at everyone else's choices, while your own show makes millions off celebrity gossip and political division." Jimmy stood up straighter, his own anger now fully unleashed. "At least I don't pretend to be above it all while participating in it. At least I don't play the victim while simultaneously being the aggressor." "Aggressor?" Meghan's voice cracked, with disbelief. "Jimmy, I came here to talk about charity work and ended up being lectured about accountability by someone who makes fat jokes and political rants for a living. If anyone's being aggressive here, it's not me." The exchange had devolved into something that resembled a public therapy session more than a television interview, with years of accumulated grievances being aired in front of a live studio audience and millions of viewers at home. The security team, positioned strategically around the studio, began moving slightly closer to the stage area, though whether they were more concerned about the host or the guest was unclear to observers. The sight of security personnel subtly repositioning themselves around the stage seemed to add an extra layer of tension to an already explosive atmosphere. Jimmy noticed the movement first, his eyes darting toward the burly men in dark suits, who had appeared at strategic points around the studio. "Really, Meghan? You're making my security team nervous now. Is this how you handle every conversation that doesn't go your way?" The comment seemed to reignite Meghan's fury just as it appeared she might be calming down. "Your security team should be nervous about you, not me. I'm not the one who invited a guest onto my show just to humiliate them in front of millions of people." "I never lied to anyone," Jimmy shot back, abandoning any pretense of maintaining his professional composure. "My team told your team we were doing a standard interview. You're the one who turned it into a therapy session." "A therapy session?" Meghan laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Jimmy, if this were therapy, you'd be the patient, not the doctor. You clearly have some serious issues with powerful women that you need to work through." The accusation hit Jimmy like a physical blow, and his reaction was immediate and visceral. "Don't you dare psychoanalyze me on my own show. And don't make this about gender when it's about your behavior." Hillary Clinton sat in that same chair and handled tough questions like a professional. So did Elizabeth Warren. So did Kamala Harris. The difference is they didn't throw tantrums when they didn't like the questions. Tantrums? Meghan's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than her earlier shouting. Jimmy, you just compared me to actual politicians who signed up for public scrutiny as part of their job description. I married into a family, and somehow that made me fair game for every cruel comment and invasion of privacy you people could dream up. You married into the most famous family in the world and then acted surprised when people paid attention to you, Jimmy pressed on ruthlessly. They didn't just pay attention, Meghan's voice rose dangerously. They dissected every breath I took, turned my family into tabloid stars, and made my mental health struggles into entertainment. So don't minimize what I went through. Instead of handling it with grace, like other royals have done for generations, you decided to burn everything down, Jimmy shot back. You can't profit from your story and then complain when people want to hear all of it, Jimmy continued relentlessly. I never wanted to profit from my story, Meghan replied, her voice cracking. I wanted to live quietly, but you people wouldn't let me. You forced me to defend myself, then criticized me for it. Jimmy's next words crossed the final line. Maybe the problem is that your defense doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The statement seemed to drain the fight from Meghan momentarily. When she spoke again, her voice carried weary dignity. You're right, Jimmy. My defense doesn't hold up under your kind of scrutiny, because it's not about finding truth. It's about exploiting weakness for entertainment. And I'm done being your entertainment. She turned toward the exit with sudden decisiveness. Jimmy, panicking, made a desperate attempt to maintain control. You can't just walk off in the middle of an interview. Watch me, she replied calmly, more unsettling than her earlier anger. This is how it works when someone decides they've had enough. Jimmy's panic became visible. Security, don't let her leave the studio. Instead of being intimidated, Meghan seemed strengthened by his desperation. Really, Jimmy? You're going to physically prevent me from leaving? Is that the host you want your audience to see? The question hung in the air as security personnel found themselves caught between their employer's instructions and the obvious public relations nightmare that would result from physically restraining a departing guest. Jimmy, realizing too late the trap he had created for himself, tried to backtrack. I didn't mean we have a show to finish, he stammered, his usual eloquence deserting him completely. No, Jimmy, you have a show to finish, Meghan replied, gathering her purse and walking toward the exit with the kind of regal bearing that reminded everyone watching exactly who she had once been and what world she had come from. I have a life to live, and I'm not going to waste another minute of it on people who think my pain is their entertainment. The security team parted to let her pass, their uncertainty about how to handle the situation evident in their hesitant movements. Jimmy stood frozen behind his desk, watching his career-defining moment slip away as Meghan reached the studio door. She paused one final time, turning back to address not Jimmy, but the studio audience directly. To everyone who came here tonight, expecting to see a normal interview, I apologize that you had to witness this instead. But sometimes the only way to stop being treated badly is to refuse to accept it anymore. With those words, she pushed through the studio doors and disappeared into the corridor beyond, leaving behind a stunned silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Jimmy stood motionless at his desk, his face cycling through expressions of anger, embarrassment, and dawning realization of what had just occurred. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of the aftermath, as audience members began talking among themselves. Security personnel looked to each other for guidance, and production staff scrambled to figure out how to salvage what remained of the evening's taping. What had started as a routine promotional interview had transformed into a cultural moment that would be analyzed, debated, and referenced for years to come. A perfect storm of celebrity culture, media dynamics, and human emotion that reminded Everyone watching why live television remained the most unpredictable form of entertainment in existence. So there you have it, the complete breakdown of one of the most shocking moments in late-night television history. What do you think really drove Meghan to that breaking point? Was Jimmy out of line with his questioning? Or was Meghan being overly sensitive? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that define our celebrity-obsessed culture.